Power in the United States has always carried a hidden burden. Behind every speech, handshake, parade, and campaign promise stands a quieter reality. At some point, every president faces a decision that cannot be escaped. Some choices determine the fate of nations. Others cost thousands of lives. Some preserve the Union, while others leave permanent scars on American history. The presidency is often described as the most powerful office in the world, but history shows it is also one of the loneliest. In moments of crisis, presidents are forced to choose between terrible options, knowing that no decision will satisfy everyone and that history itself may judge them harshly. From war and rebellion to economic collapse and nuclear fear, the story of the American presidency is, in many ways, the story of impossible decisions.
When George Washington became the first president in 1789, the United States was fragile and uncertain. The new Constitution had never been tested. European powers doubted the country would survive. Washington understood that every action he took would establish traditions for future generations. His hardest decision came during the war between Britain and revolutionary France. Many Americans wanted to support France because France had helped secure American independence. Others feared being dragged into another devastating war. Washington chose neutrality. The decision angered both political allies and critics, but he believed the United States was too weak to survive another major conflict. By refusing to enter the war, Washington protected the young republic and established the principle that American survival mattered more than emotional loyalty abroad.
John Adams soon faced a similar crisis during tensions with France in the late 1790s. French ships attacked American vessels in what became known as the Quasi-War. Many members of Adams's own party demanded a full military declaration. The pressure was enormous, yet Adams resisted the calls for war and instead pursued diplomacy. The decision likely cost him political support and contributed to his defeat in the election of 1800. But historians later recognized that avoiding war may have saved the young nation from economic and military disaster.
Thomas Jefferson confronted a contradiction at the heart of the country. He believed in limited government, yet in 1803 he faced an opportunity that could transform the United States forever. Napoleon offered to sell the massive Louisiana Territory. The Constitution did not clearly grant the president authority to purchase foreign land. Jefferson worried the acquisition might violate the very principles he defended. Still, he made the decision to proceed. The Louisiana Purchase doubled the size of the United States and reshaped the future of North America.
James Madison's presidency was defined by the difficult choice to confront Britain in the War of 1812. British interference with American trade and the forced impressment of sailors created national outrage. Madison hesitated, knowing the United States was militarily weak, but political pressure and national pride pushed the country toward conflict. The war nearly destroyed Washington itself, yet the survival of the United States strengthened American identity and confirmed that the country would continue to exist as an independent power.
James Monroe faced one of the most delicate foreign policy questions in early American history. European monarchies considered reclaiming former colonies in Latin America. Monroe and his advisors understood that the United States lacked the military strength to stop European empires directly. Still, Monroe declared that further European colonization in the Americas would not be tolerated. The Monroe Doctrine became one of the defining principles of American foreign policy, even though enforcing it initially depended heavily on British naval power.
Andrew Jackson's hardest decision remains one of the darkest chapters in presidential history. Jackson supported the forced removal of Native American tribes from their ancestral lands in the Southeast. Despite legal victories by Native nations and fierce resistance, Jackson pushed forward with removal policies that led to the Trail of Tears. Thousands died from disease, starvation, and exposure. Jackson believed expansion was necessary for the future of the United States, but the human cost remains a permanent stain on the nation's history.
James K. Polk faced the explosive question of war with Mexico. Determined to expand the United States to the Pacific Ocean, Polk sent troops into disputed territory near the Texas border. Fighting soon erupted, and Congress declared war. The conflict dramatically expanded American territory, adding lands that would later become states such as California, Arizona, and New Mexico. Yet the victory also intensified the national conflict over slavery, helping push the country closer to civil war.
No president faced a greater test than Abraham Lincoln. In 1861, the United States began to collapse as Southern states seceded from the Union. Lincoln's hardest decision was whether to preserve the Union through war, knowing the cost would be catastrophic. As the Civil War continued, Lincoln made another historic decision, issuing the Emancipation Proclamation. The move transformed the war from a struggle to preserve the Union into a fight against slavery itself. Lincoln understood the risks. The decision could weaken support in the North and provoke greater resistance in the South. Instead, it redefined the moral purpose of the war and changed the course of American history forever.
After Lincoln's assassination, Andrew Johnson faced the challenge of rebuilding a shattered nation. His decisions during Reconstruction deeply divided Americans. Johnson favored rapid restoration of Southern states with limited protections for formerly enslaved people. Congress fiercely opposed him, leading to one of the first impeachment crises in American history.
Ulysses S. Grant struggled with the growing violence of white supremacist groups in the South after the Civil War. Grant chose to use federal power against organizations like the Ku Klux Klan, sending troops and enforcing civil rights protections. His actions temporarily weakened extremist violence, though the broader struggle for racial equality would continue for generations.
Rutherford B. Hayes confronted a political crisis after the disputed election of 1876. To secure the presidency, Hayes accepted a compromise that effectively ended Reconstruction. Federal troops withdrew from the South, and many protections for Black Americans quickly collapsed. The decision stabilized the immediate political crisis, but opened the door to decades of segregation and disenfranchisement.
William McKinley faced the decision of whether to go to war with Spain in 1898. After the explosion of the battleship USS Maine in Havana Harbor and rising public outrage, pressure for war became overwhelming. McKinley hesitated, fearing the human cost, but eventually asked Congress for authorization. The Spanish-American War transformed the United States into an overseas imperial power, with territories including Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines.
Theodore Roosevelt confronted growing industrial power and international instability. One of his hardest decisions involved supporting the construction of the Panama Canal. Roosevelt backed Panamanian independence from Colombia, allowing the United States to secure canal rights. Critics accused him of imperial overreach, but Roosevelt believed the canal was essential for American strategic and economic power.
Woodrow Wilson faced perhaps the defining choice of the early 20th century, whether to enter World War I. Wilson initially promised neutrality, but unrestricted German submarine warfare and the Zimmermann telegram changed public opinion. In 1917, Wilson asked Congress for a declaration of war, arguing the world must be made safe for democracy. American intervention helped shift the balance of the conflict, but the war's devastation permanently altered global politics.
Franklin D. Roosevelt inherited a nation broken by the Great Depression. His first great decision was whether the federal government should intervene directly in the economy on an unprecedented scale. Roosevelt launched the New Deal, expanding government power to combat unemployment, poverty, and economic collapse. Later, Roosevelt faced an even greater crisis after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941. He led the United States into World War II, directing a massive global conflict that reshaped the 20th century. Near the end of the war, Roosevelt also approved the Manhattan Project, laying the foundation for the atomic age.
Harry Truman inherited the presidency during the final months of World War II. Soon, he faced one of the most controversial decisions in human history, whether to use atomic bombs against Japan. American planners feared that an invasion of Japan could cause enormous casualties on both sides. Truman authorized the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945.
Japan surrendered shortly afterward, ending the war, but the bombings introduced the world to nuclear warfare and remain the subject of intense moral debate.
Dwight D. Eisenhower, a former general, faced mounting Cold War tensions with the Soviet Union. One of his hardest decisions came during the crisis in Little Rock, Arkansas in 1957. When segregationists resisted the integration of Central High School, Eisenhower sent federal troops to enforce the law. The decision demonstrated that the federal government would uphold constitutional rights, even against local resistance.
John F. Kennedy confronted the terrifying possibility of nuclear war during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. American intelligence discovered Soviet nuclear missiles stationed in Cuba, only miles from the American coast. Military leaders urged immediate airstrikes or invasion. Kennedy instead chose a naval blockade and tense negotiations. For 13 days, the world stood on the edge of catastrophe. Eventually, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev agreed to remove the missiles, and nuclear war was avoided.
Lyndon B. Johnson faced a decision that would define his presidency and divide America for decades, escalating the Vietnam War. Johnson feared that withdrawing from Vietnam would damage American credibility during the Cold War. After the Gulf of Tonkin incident, he dramatically expanded military involvement. The war consumed his presidency, caused massive casualties, and triggered widespread protest across the United States.
Richard Nixon confronted the reality that the Vietnam War could not be won at an acceptable cost. His hardest decision involved negotiating American withdrawal while attempting to preserve U.S. influence. Nixon expanded bombing campaigns even as peace talks continued. Eventually, American troops withdrew, but the war ended with the fall of Saigon in 1975, after Nixon had already resigned because of the Watergate scandal.
Gerald Ford then faced a deeply unpopular decision of his own. In 1974, he granted a full pardon to Richard Nixon after Watergate. Ford believed the country needed to move beyond the crisis and avoid a prolonged national trial. But the pardon damaged public trust and likely contributed to Ford's election defeat.
Jimmy Carter's presidency was shaped by the Iran hostage crisis. In 1980, Carter approved Operation Eagle Claw, a risky military mission to rescue American hostages in Tehran. Mechanical failures and a deadly collision in the Iranian desert forced the mission to abort. The disaster humiliated the administration and revealed the limitations of American power during the crisis.
Ronald Reagan faced Cold War tensions that repeatedly threatened global stability. One of his most difficult decisions came after the 1983 bombing of the Marine barracks in Beirut, which killed 241 American service members. Reagan eventually withdrew U.S. forces from Lebanon, balancing concerns about American credibility with the growing danger of deeper involvement.
George H.W. Bush confronted the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait in 1990. Bush chose to build a broad international coalition and launch Operation Desert Storm to expel Iraqi forces. The military campaign succeeded quickly, but Bush also made the controversial decision not to advance to Baghdad and remove Saddam Hussein from power. At the time, he feared occupation could destabilize the region further.
Bill Clinton faced a humanitarian crisis during the Kosovo War in 1999. Clinton authorized NATO airstrikes against Serbian forces accused of ethnic cleansing. The intervention occurred without a formal United Nations Security Council authorization, reflecting the growing complexity of international humanitarian conflicts after the Cold War. George W. Bush faced the defining crisis of the early 21st century after the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001. His hardest decision involved launching the War on Terror. Bush ordered the invasion of Afghanistan to destroy al-Qaeda and remove the Taliban government sheltering the organization. In 2003, he also approved the invasion of Iraq based on claims that Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction. No such weapons were found, and the conflict became one of the most controversial wars in modern American history.
Barack Obama confronted difficult choices involving both war and national security. In 2011, he approved the covert operation that led to the death of al-Qaeda leader Osama bin Laden in Pakistan. Obama understood the enormous risk If the mission failed, the political and international consequences could be severe. The operation succeeded, marking one of the most significant moments in the fight against terrorism.
Donald Trump faced the unprecedented global crisis of the COVID-19 pandemic. Decisions about travel restrictions, emergency powers, economic shutdowns, and vaccine development became deeply politicized. Trump also faced intense pressure during the final months of his presidency after the disputed 2020 election and the January 6th attack on the United States Capitol.
Joe Biden inherited a divided nation, still struggling with the pandemic and international instability. One of his most difficult decisions involved ending the long American war in Afghanistan. In 2021, Biden proceeded with the withdrawal agreement negotiated under the previous administration. The rapid collapse of the Afghan government and chaotic evacuation from Kabul drew global criticism, but Biden defended the decision by arguing that extending the war indefinitely would only continue the cycle of conflict.
Across more than 2 centuries, the presidency has evolved from a fragile experiment into one of the most influential institutions in human history. Yet the essential burden has never changed. Every president eventually confronts a moment when the future depends on a single choice made under pressure, uncertainty, and fear. Some decisions preserved democracy. Others caused suffering that lasted for generations. Some leaders were praised in their own time and condemned later. Others were criticized immediately but vindicated by history decades afterward. What makes these decisions so powerful is not simply their scale, but their permanence. Once a president acts, the consequences cannot be recalled. Soldiers march into battle. Economies rise or collapse. Laws reshape society. Entire generations live with the outcome. The presidency is often remembered through elections, speeches, and personalities, but history is ultimately shaped by decisions made in moments when no perfect answer exists.
In the end, the hardest decisions of America's presidents reveal something deeper about leadership itself. True leadership is not the absence of doubt. It is the willingness to act despite uncertainty, knowing that millions of lives may depend on the outcome. From Washington's neutrality to Lincoln's emancipation, from Truman's atomic decision to Kennedy's restraint during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the history of the presidency is a story of men standing at the edge of history, forced to choose a path while the world watches. Some succeeded brilliantly, some failed catastrophically, but every decision left a mark on the United States and on the world beyond it.